tomorrow, and I'm a teacher and teacher trainer here at International House London. This is just a short video to say hello and how happy we are to be working with you to create this new series of short videos on current trends. Within this series, we'll be looking at a range of topics. We'll be looking at language and skills, we'll be looking at different approaches, and we'll also be looking at different techniques and materials. Within the language and skills topic, we'll be looking at pronunciation techniques for large classes. We'll be looking at making reading more fun and interactive, how to evaluate a student's speaking, and using critical thinking in the classroom. For approaches, the videos will cover things like memorization and recall tasks. We'll be looking at using situational presentations, and we'll also be looking at using dialogues and grammar in tasks. And then finally, with the techniques and materials, we'll be looking at gamification, we'll be looking at using and exploiting dialogues, and we'll also be looking at correction techniques that you can use in your classroom. Okay, so thank you again. We really hope you enjoy the videos.
Hi, my name is Michael Turner, a teacher and teacher trainer here at International House London. As teachers, we often have a limited amount of time and resources available to us, and it's a useful skill to be able to make a little bit of material go a long way. And so I'm excited today to share with you some ideas on how we can exploit a common resource that's available in almost every course book that I've ever used: dialogues. These dialogues come ready-made, and often in the form of a written script with an accompanying audio that you can listen to. And the coursebook uses them to practice listening work, followed by a grammar or vocabulary focus. The lesson might end with a read aloud activity where students perform the dialogue in pairs or small groups. Today, I'd like to look at ways you can exploit and adapt these dialogues in a way that requires little or no previous preparation. I'd like to compare for a moment two different types of dialogue that you might find in the coursebook. This first one is written and designed to exemplify a target grammar structure. Have a read and guess the grammar focus. That's right, it's be going to for plans about the future. Now, if you read this dialogue out loud, you'll quickly hear how unnatural it sounds. It's not to say that these types of dialogue are not useful. In fact, they're designed in this way. They've been modified so that they contain multiple examples of target language, so that learners will be exposed to that structure repeatedly. And through this exposure, the idea is that they are more likely to notice the target language. The dialogue itself provides a mini context for the grammar, and therefore hopefully makes it more understandable. So for short examples of grammar and context, they serve their purpose quite well. However, as an example of a realistic dialogue you might expect to hear outside the classroom in the real world, they fall short. And this is because their design has caused them to sound pretty inauthentic. There's unnatural language examples, there's overly repeating grammar structures, and the length is very short, making the skills work of listening and speaking quite under-challenging.
Se il video ti è piaciuto, metti mi piace e mi raccomando, seguici per non perderti i nostri prossimi video sul canale YouTube.
A second and more preferable type of dialogue are those known as situational dialogues. So these can be recognized because they're things like ordering at a restaurant, visiting the doctor, that kind of thing. These also appear regularly in coursebooks, but because they are situated in real-life contexts, they actually sound a lot more authentic and closer to the real thing. There's a wider range of language, so not just one target structure repeated over and over again, but a richer and more diverse range of structures, lexical chunks, functional language. They also have a wider range of intonation and pronunciation features usually. You can usually divide situational dialogues found in coursebooks into two broad types. Type 1, the macro function, is socializing, and type 2, the macro function, is exchanging goods and services. Let's have a look here. We can see small talk and the friends discussing a dilemma fall under socializing. That's because the dialogue is interpersonal. The goal is to build friendships, make connections, and strengthen relationships. You can see the other four here fall under type 2. These are sometimes called transactional exchanges, and that's because the main purpose here is to sell something, to buy something, and there is an exchange going on. And so because the different speakers in these two different situations have in fact different goals to achieve, the language they use to achieve those goals will differ, sometimes quite significantly. This variation in language is called register, and a helpful way to reflect on the register of a dialogue is to ask ourselves 3 questions. 1. What is going on here in the exchange? 2. Who is participating in this exchange? And 3. How are they participating? To illustrate, let's compare these 2 types of socializing. In the small talk situation, the topic of what they're talking about is probably different than in the friends discussing a dilemma. Perhaps the man in the small talk situation is showing his colleague a picture of his pet. And in the friends discussing a dilemma, it may be a relationship dilemma or a work dilemma. This will obviously affect the vocabulary that comes out of the conversations. Another thing that affects is what we call tenor. So this is about the relationship between the 2 speakers. For example, the 2 people in the small talk situation, if they're talking about each other's pets, let's say they're colleagues at work, or maybe one is the boss and he's getting to know his new employee. The way they talk to each other will be different than if the 2 friends in the second situation were talking about pets. That's because of the social closeness and the power relationship between them. So the tenor will affect language choice as well. So if tenor considers the social distance or closeness between the 2 participants, then mode considers the physical closeness or distance between the 2 participants. For example, in the second situation, we can imagine one friend texting another to ask him for advice. This change of mode from spoken to written communication will also influence the choice of language between the 2 participants. The interaction will also develop in a different way because the texting example, there may be some time between each message, whereas in the face-to-face conversation, it's happening in real time. So now I'm going to share with you some different ways we can exploit these dialogues. And before we get into the activities, I always recommend teachers do an initial listening. And what we want to do is establish from that initial listening who the speakers are, where they are, and what they're talking about. This will help make the connection there between the mode, the field and the tenor, and the subsequent language work. And it also helps learners get used to the sound of the speakers' voices and get a general gist of the situation. So I'm going to play you a dialogue, and here are your questions. See if you can answer them. Hi, welcome to Phone Planet. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks.
Is there anything at all I can help you with?
Yes, I'm looking to replace my phone. This one's old and slow, and last week I dropped it and broke the screen.
Oh no.
That's okay, it's time for an upgrade.
Well, you've come to the right place. Do you have anything particular in mind?
Actually, I was hoping you could give me some advice.
Absolutely.
You see, I've always used an Android, but all my friends have iPhones. Do you think I should change?
Well, iPhones are very popular, and for good reason. Tell me a little bit about what you liked about your current phone.
Well, for a start it was cheap, and it has a good camera and the battery life is excellent, but I keep running out of storage and it's become really slow.
Okay, well, this latest iPhone has 250 gigs of memory, and its new processing chip makes it super fast.
Wow, is that the price? That's double the price of an Android.
I can see why you'd feel that way. I felt the price was a little high too, but once I started using it, I understood why. This is the phone I have.
I'm not sure, that's a little out of my price range. Do you have a cheaper model?
Sure. Take a look at this one. It's not going to give you as much storage. Okay, so that's our dialogue. Let's check our ideas.
Se il video ti è piaciuto, metti mi piace e mi raccomando, seguici per non perderti i nostri prossimi video sul canale YouTube.
So I've shown you the gist listening I would do for this audio. Before doing the gist, I would start with an initial discussion to help activate their previous experience, vocabulary, and ideas. And we know that later they're going to perform this dialogue. So what can we do before that to make this more engaging, more interesting, and to exploit the material that's already here? Okay, you've heard the dialogue. Now, if you're watching this with other teachers, this might be a good time to pause the video and discuss what you would do with your learners. with this dialogue. So here are 5 ideas. So idea number 1 is called a board grab. Before the lesson, the teacher reads through the audio script and identifies useful lexical collocations that match the register of the dialogue. The teacher can type them out or handwrite them on bits of card, and then they'll stick them around the room, nice and big. Notice here, below the line, I've added some extra collocations that do not appear in the audio script. This will create an element of competition and also selectiveness in the part of the listener. It's called a board grab because you stick the vocabulary on the board, but you can also put it around the room. If you have classes of under 20, this would work well. For example, dividing them into 2 groups of 10. The teacher plays the recording and the students have to run and grab any collocations that they hear, winning points for their team. If your classes are larger, you might want to create cut-ups and give it to them in smaller groups. So here in this photo, you can see a group of 4, half of them are A's, half of them are B's. I'm playing the audio, and every time they hear one of the collocations, they grab it. So it's a competition to see who can grab the most lexical items. Sometimes you need to listen twice, 3 times. It's a nice, competitive, fun, intensive listening. Idea 2 is called function categorizing. In this activity, instead of focusing them on collocations, we're going to look at the functional language within the dialogue. As you know, functional language are chunks of language, and we use them to achieve things in English. So here, the teacher will go through the audio script before the class and highlight useful functional language. Then in the lesson, after a lead-in discussion and the gist listening, the teacher gives the audio script to the students with the functional language highlighted. On a separate piece of paper, you have a box containing the functions, and what the students do is work together in pairs or small groups to match the language to the functions they think the language is performing. Here's a key of what the answers would look like. A useful activity to get learners thinking about the effect of the language they're using. What happens? And also a great opportunity for the teacher to provide other examples of language they could use to perform the same functions in the same situation. So whereas the first 2 examples were working at the lexical level within a clause or sentence, this one takes it to a more discourse level. So we're really following a sequence of back and forth across the discourse. So what the teacher does is, before the class, takes all of the customer utterances, makes them one colour, and all of the shop assistant utterances another colour. The teacher then chops them up and shuffles them, gives them to the learners, and they have to rebuild the dialogue based on what they understood from the first listening. And this really gets them thinking, what is the correct response to this piece of language? A greeting like, "Hi, how you doing?" has an accepted response. You might say, "I'm good, thanks." "Fine, how are you?" "All good, thanks for asking." So by rebuilding the dialogue, we're encouraging learners to be inquisitive about the language, investigate the language, look for clues in order to repiece something into a linear sequence. So as easily as we can build something up, we can take it away. This 4th activity is called a progressive deletion, and the idea is the teacher displays a dialogue, learners get into A and B's, and they recite the dialogue together in pairs, and then the teacher moves to the next slide and you'll see the same dialogue, but one of the words is missing from each line, and they read it from beginning to end again, while trying to remember the word that was missing. And then the next slide, another word's missing, and they read it from top to bottom. And then the next slide, another word's missing. And the idea is as the words slowly disappear from the screen, they're being stored in the learner's memory. The beginning to end repetition helps with this. Now, of course, you don't want to remove too many words, and I think you should focus on the words that are part of useful collocations and functional language. So be realistic with what you ask and try not to demotivate by removing too many words.
Se il video ti è piaciuto, metti mi piace e mi raccomando, seguici per non perderti i nostri prossimi video sul canale YouTube.
So this last idea is called interpretations. It's really fun. What happens is learners read the dialogue and perform it with each other in closed groups. And what they have to do is they change the way they read the dialogue based on the interpretation. So you give them different situations and they have to change their intonation, the way they pronounce words, the types of words they're using in order to fit each scenario. So take a look at a couple of ideas here. How would you perform the dialogue knowing you were part of one of these situations? So we've looked at different ways we can adapt a basic dialogue in a course book. Let's now look at the interaction patterns and remind ourselves how and why we might pair and group learners when doing these activities. Why not experiment with Scott Thornbury's suggestion of moving from open pairs to closed pairs to final performance? So with this particular dialogue, it would look like this. The teacher takes on the role of the shop assistant and the student performs as the customer. They do this in front of the class and then they swap, except the teacher asks a new student to try the role of the shop assistant and the teacher takes on the role of the customer. After these two demonstrations, everyone has seen and heard the conversation twice, both time with the teacher taking on one of the roles. Next is a final demonstration, but between two students and without the teacher, which they can do because they've seen it. At this stage, learners should be motivated and ready to rehearse in their groups. The class breaks off into pairs. They rehearse the dialogues with each other and then they swap roles and they try it again. Meanwhile, the teacher is monitoring and deciding if they want to nominate someone for a final performance or they could simply ask for volunteers. So you see how the first three steps serve as a kind of scaffolded teacher demonstration that turns into a student demonstration, followed by safe closed group rehearsals and practice, and finally an optional final performance if anyone's feeling brave. This is encouraging a lot of communication and a lot of practice and rehearsal, and I think it's great. So thank you for taking the time to consider ways you can exploit dialogues with me today. I hope some of the activities are interesting and useful for you and you might like to try them in your classrooms. You can find many more activities like these ones and the ones I've included in today's session in two wonderful books, How to Teach Speaking by Scott Thornbury and Dialogue Activities by Nick Bilborough. This second book is entirely dedicated to dialogues and it has many exciting and interesting activities, and I really encourage you to have a look at it and try some other ideas out as well. I'll leave you now with a summary of the key points of this session and also a bibliography of the sources I used when preparing this session.